Welcome to another time where I summarize the discussion we had at Davison United Methodist Church of the United Methodist social principles. So as we were looking at those, we had our conversation and discussion, and Pastor Rob McPherson, am going to summarize our conversation for you. Thank you for joining us for this. Today we had thought we were going to get through a couple of different sections. If you listened to last week's episode, you'll know I had planned on getting through a couple, but we ran into the situation that sometimes happens where there's so many stories and so much discussion, so many experiences that we spend our whole time on one subject. And this week's subject was war and military service. The statement has 6 paragraphs, and the first paragraph is very aspirational and clear. The Church deplores war and all other forms of violent conflict and urges the peaceful settlement of all disputes. We yearn for the day when there will be no more war and people will live together in peace and justice. So a pretty straightforward statement. We deplore war, we long for peace. Then each of the next segments begins to take that in to clarify and to talk about some different aspects of that. So the second paragraph talks about rejecting war as an instrument of foreign policy. It opposes preemptive strikes. It has a section that essentially wishes that we, instead of spending so much money on military, we spent it instead on eradicating poverty. And it calls for the end of producing nuclear weapons and also for their elimination. The third paragraph admits that there are a variety of Christian positions on war. Let me read it. It's really well done because it's so true to any group of Christians I've ever sat down with. Christians have struggled with the issue of war since the time of Jesus. Some Christians have argued historically that war and other acts of violence are never acceptable, while other believers have asserted that it is sometimes necessary to take up arms in self-defense or to defend the innocent and prevent unchecked aggression, tyranny, and genocide. And I certainly, whenever I'm with a group of people, there are always those that are pretty much pacifists, that don't think that there should be any form of war, and there are those who wish there wasn't war, but as one of our men said, you gotta do what you gotta do, but it breaks our heart. I thought that was an amazing summary, and that was from one of our veterans. An amazing summary of that second idea, that we really don't want to do it, but sometimes because of heartbreaking conditions, people feel necessary to. So both of those Christian positions are acknowledged in the statement. The third paragraph begins to talk about military service, and this first one says that it honors those who choose to take part in military service as a result of their personal conviction, and that we urge that they perform their duties in harmony with their Christian faith in accordance to the laws of the Geneva Conventions. So I got curious on the Geneva Conventions. Quite honestly, I didn't know what I was getting into. It is a very, very long document. I found a summary. The summary alone was 7 pages. Essentially, the Geneva Conventions are a series of things that were adopted by many, many, many countries, starting in the late 1940s after World War II. And the first parts of the Geneva Conventions have 4 sections. And the first one is about medical personnel and those who are wounded and how they're treated. The second one is the same thing as the first one, but it's talking about it at sea and in ships. The third one primarily relates to POWs, the fourth one to civilians, And then since the 1940s, there have been 2 editions. They're called protocols. Protocol 1 is about it's of various things. It's about not recruiting children under 15. It's about not doing devastation to food supplies and water supplies so that civilians are killed. It's about not using things that cause long-term suffering. So there's a number of things in that one. It's got a lot to it. And then the more recent one takes all of those things from the prior Geneva Conventions and those various things and applies them not only to wars between countries but to civil wars and begins to define those. So that's kind of the Geneva Conventions. So this one says, great, serve in the military, do that with your Christian faith in mind and in accordance with those laws. The next paragraph, the 5th paragraph, talks about honoring and supporting pacifists. So this is the other side, those who are conscientious objectors, who can't serve in the military, and may need to take non-combatant roles, or maybe even, this one suggests other forms of community service rather than military as a potential. It does say in this section that we oppose compulsory military service and urge governments to abolish this practice and instead allow people to choose other forms of serving their country. I was surprised. I took some time then to see how many countries in the world do still have compulsory military service for all of their individuals. Some only do for the men, but many also do for all members. And if we start thinking about, again, the United Methodist Church as a church around the world, many of our people who voted on saying this, we shouldn't require military service, come from countries that do, in fact, require military service. So the idea is, rather than forcing people to serve in the military, those who wish to serve in the military should, but others, this statement says, should be allowed to contribute in other creative ways to their national good. The last of the paragraphs says we commit ourselves to supporting all people as they discern how best to model the nonviolent example of Jesus. And I really need to read this one because it goes into a number of things. So the church supports and guides those who serve in the military, those who are conscientious objectors, veterans living with physical, psychological, spiritual, and moral injury, families of people affected by military service, and we urge the church to care and work for systemic justice for all people affected by war, and to advocate for peacemaking and nonviolent conflict transformation in global and local conflicts. So it has a lot in that section, essentially supporting the choices and the individuals wherever they're coming from, continuing to advocate for peace and nonviolence, but also saying that we need to care for people, whatever their past has been and wherever they've been involved. This is a pretty typical statement where we acknowledge that people come from a variety of backgrounds, and as a church, we offer a place of healing and wholeness, whatever that background is. So then we got into some of the conversations about this, specifically talking about, started with experience of military service. And so as I mentioned, we have one veteran in our midst and several who had family members. The veteran in our midst said, if it hadn't been for the military, I'd have been in deep water. It's how he learned to trust other people and the people that he worked with. He also said that he was glad that they have chaplains present because it was good to walk by someone with a chaplain's insignia from time to time and be reminded of his faith. The people who had family members who were involved talked about the concerns they had for safety while they were away. One person had a son in the reserves and another that went to Iraq, and after being in Iraq had a number of health problems. One had a husband who said the military was the best thing that ever happened to him. The structure really helped him. Another had an ex-husband who had been in Vietnam and returned with significant PTSD. We talked about those who enter the military because of the GI Bill and see it as an opportunity for education that they might not otherwise have. Let's see. Then we talked about people's experience of war, which somewhat overlapped with the experience of serving in the military. Not everyone who served in the military served in a time of war. Our person who was a veteran served in Korea and said there was a war, but there wasn't a war. In other words, I think he served in a time when officially there wasn't a war, but there was still, it was beginning, and there was a lot of conflict, and so there was still warlike activities happening. What else did we talk about with war? We talked about a person who had 3 aunts who got nurses training during World War II. We talked about a person whose friend's mother was in a prison camp during World War II. And that must have been a terrible time. One person shared that she was a child during World War II and had a hiding place all picked out in case the Germans came as a child. And so living under the fear of a potential war in the homeland, even as people were at war farther away. I've known a number of people. I've had the good fortune of having a number of veterans that have been parts of my church. I've seen people with severe post-traumatic stress syndrome. I have had individuals who had medical problems from Agent Orange or from war injuries. People who couldn't talk about their time of service because of how they felt about it, and others who were very open about it and did talk about their experiences. I forever remember the gentleman who talked about being a tail gunner in a bomber and how he didn't expect to live through even 1 or 2 flights. They told him his life expectancy was almost non-existent in that job, and yet he survived. Essentially, what we talked about overall was that war itself is a terrible thing. And we came back to that 3rd paragraph where it talks about some are pacifists and some feel, well, unfortunately, from time to time, it's necessary. Most of our group leaned toward the necessary. A couple were more the pacifist. Certainly, I myself, although I do understand how sometimes it seems very necessary, I'm not sure that I could be engaged personally in the violence. I'm a softie. It would be hard for me, and I would have to take another role. And so we talked about a lot of those kinds of things, where we were, how the whole talk of war made us feel. Finally, we did get into, as we always do, some of the scriptures that help us talk about war, we acknowledged that war is a common subject in the Bible. We have, wow, so many wars between the nations there. People of Israel being taken and then returning home. But we have also some of the strongest prophecies of hope. Isaiah 2:4 and Micah 4:3 talk about the day when people will beat their swords into plows and nations will learn war no more. We have Jesus' words in Matthew 5:9 of blessed are the peacemakers. I did point out a chapter of the Bible that I don't think any of us, many of us have read the Bible multiple times, so we know we've read it, but we really hadn't noticed it much. Deuteronomy 20 has a section on rules for war in it. They're clearly old rules, but they are very interesting. It lists several reasons why a person might get out of serving as a soldier in the war and why they might be sent home. It gives some rules of not destroying the trees around. It gives some explanation of when you are attacking a city, you need to offer them a peaceful solution first before attacking. So there's a number of things in there. Deuteronomy 20, I invite you to take a look at it just out of curiosity and to begin to see what some of those rules of war that were laid out in the Mosaic Law are. Finally, I pointed out Luke chapter 3, verse 14, in which some soldiers asked Jesus what they should do, and Jesus answers, "Don't cheat or harass anyone and be satisfied with your pay." In some ways, that feels a little like Jesus is saying, obey the Geneva Conventions. Don't abuse people, don't cheat, don't harass, but serve as you do so, I suppose, respectfully of people as much as possible. I don't want to put words into Jesus' mouth, but that's kind of how it feels of use the principles of your faith to guide your service. So that's where we went with our discussion of war and military service today. I would invite you to reflect on your experience of both. Perhaps you served in the military, perhaps you had family that did, maybe you've been to war, maybe you've lived through a time of war, maybe you've watched loved ones go to war. I don't know. Each of us really does have a lot to share on this. We leave this topic, I think, again, feeling, I just come back to that one statement by our one veteran of war breaks our heart. It does a lot of harm, and it hurts a lot of people, and in an ideal world, there wouldn't be war, and we would find peace. And that ideal world is something that God promises to us someday. And we continue to work for it. That's part of what this statement's urging and asking. Until the time comes when nations no longer need to learn war. And I leave us with that. Thanks again for joining us this week. There will not be a video next week, but we will resume again in 2 weeks. Have yourselves a very blessed day.